introduce myself. As you may know from the program, I'm the lead discussant. And my role today, I'm from the law school, by the way, so I'm a lawyer. I'm not a geographer. I'm probably the two lawyers in the room either. So I'm coming with a legal angle on these issues. But obviously, of course, we don't have a debate. Whatever things you want to debate or whatever questions you want to ask. And the idea is that I've been asked to very briefly summarize, or highlight the main points of the three presentations, which were all very illuminating and very interesting for me anyway. I'm seeing this with lawyer's eyes, so sometimes I jump, sometimes, oh, this is a very interesting point I hadn't thought about. So it's a very interesting day for me. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to come to this morning's sessions because I was in a committee meeting that I had to go to. But the first thing, before I quickly summarize the three presentations that I would like to throw at you, or maybe this been discussed before, but at least then you can tell me, is what do we exactly mean by open data? Because a lot of people in their presentations talk about different types of data, and for me, coming from the legal angle, there are two sorts of data, legally speaking. There are those protected by law, be it by intellectual property rights, or by because there's a privacy issue, as Professor McCall was talking about. And there's the public data that is basically owned, in inverted commas, owned by the government, right? And that's public. Now, open data, that's to me, can mean plenty of different things. Is there a law protecting the data, or should because you're talking about private or corporate data, and then you're talking about data, especially you were talking about data coming from the government, so there may be a debate that we can have on this. Now, to summarize the three presentations, or to give really the highlights of the three presentations, I would say Catherine Mulligan said that the aim of her research is to use open data to solve the problem we face today. One thing that struck me in your presentation, which I thought was really, really interesting, is what exactly you meant by where is data coming from? Because it seems to me from your presentation there's a lot of data that actually comes either from governments or at whatever level, local or national, and then there's data coming from private companies. And that to me, by law you can't force a company unless there's a specific law that says the company has to give the data. You can't actually force these companies to give the data. So that may be an obstacle in research, and I would be interested to see what kind of issues are involved in that respect. I mean, are there specific laws that say, you talked about different countries, I think that force the companies to give that data in certain circumstances, or do they do it voluntarily, and what kind of obstacles come of that? So I think you had 3 points. The first one was open data to control pollution. That was one thing, to improve the control of pollution. And the second one was, second project was to reduce poverty. So use open data to reduce poverty and also increase the revenue of people who gather raw products, and actually to not make a lot of money out of doing that. How can they use the data to actually be more well off? If I understood you correctly, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. And also that was actually something that struck me in terms of the legal aspects of things, that it was very expensive to access standards. I think was it in India compared to the UK where it was free? I mean, I would be interested in what the law says about this. How come they have to pay a lot for accessing, I suppose, public data, which is state data, which is government data, which should be free, unless there is a law like Crown copyright that exists in India as well. I mean, maybe you'll be able to answer that. But that is really interesting to see what's the difference between different countries and how you can overcome that sort of problem. Maybe you want to jump in that right away.
Okay, well, I think one of the issues is the national standards organisations have a business model, which is they sell their standards to cover their costs.
Not just the national, international.
And international law, they're working with that. And we have exactly that issue in the World Met Organization. We have the same status as ISO. We have international standards, which is the historical community. And they had a big printing department with interpreters to translate things into 6 working languages and publish them. And we said, we just want to I don't just put this on the web page. It's regulatory, just make it free. And of course, you're undermining all these people whose sole existence is to follow these standards. We've got there, right? We've got rid of all of these paper documents that cost money and it's on the web. It's not quite right. We've still got some more to go because they're all on those Word documents.
But they're freely accessible, or?
Yes, if you go to the
Internationally?
if you go to the WMO website and you just rummage around, you will find the standards.
And that applies to any standards, because you were
No,
saying.
that just applies to the meteorological
Ah, the
standards.
meteorological one, okay.
That's the route we went down.
Okay, that's
Now-
interesting. But there is an issue here as far as your standards are concerned. It was oil products or whatever they were. So maybe there is an issue to be addressed internationally about, how do we come about opening that standards data? I mean, the standards themselves, you know what I mean?
So if you contrast ISO, you have to pay for the manuals and they are not cheap. If you go to OGC, its standards are pretty available.
So my sub-question to this would be interesting to see how these different standards organizations are funded. If they are funded by public money, then my view as a lawyer say they should be free. If they're funded at least by private or semi-private or public-private partnerships, then there's an issue of how this can be managed and what kind of contract should regulate the owning of the information or the
Then
pricing.
you have a split across the Atlantic between the different policies, east and west. Right? The American policy is it's funded by the taxpayer,
So
therefore
it should
it's
be
freely
free, yeah, yeah.
available. In Europe, it's funded by the taxpayer, therefore we have to reduce the tax burden by flogging it.
Yeah, I know they have that. I know that
That's
US and
fundamental.
Europe have different views on this, but Europe is trying to make it open, as you know, with the PSI directive and environmental data as well is being freed up much more.
We shouldn't hold up the Americans as a good example, because that's
No.
a federal case, not.
State data, there is a custom. It's a custom. It's not the law. It's a custom that it should be open as well. I don't know much more than that, but it's true that federal data has
More
to.
cases now coming up.
Okay, so just finishing the summary of your presentation, then you also talked very briefly about open data explained to government and cities, but you didn't have that much information on that, so if people have questions about this as well, we can ask them. Then we had a second presentation by Javier Diaz, who talked to us about the promises of open data, which are basically free, innovation, transparency, and efficiency. Then he walked us through the different points. I'm not going to summarize them all, just highlight certain things which I thought very interesting. Like, for example, yes, we want open data, but there may be some pitfalls, like if we open too much, then private sectors or bad guys might use that information against us, against the citizens, or against specific groups, like the groups who are more poor and they cannot use the data to their advantage, and the data is actually used by the private companies or by the more empowered people to actually not reduce poverty, but put them more into poverty, or to let them stay in their poverty state, or whatever. Also, something that struck me was the fact that the private sector is becoming more and more opaque, or that's what you were claiming, in comparison to the public sector, which is becoming more and more open, or at least the data, and there might be an imbalance between the private and the public sector in that respect, and I think that is a very interesting question, because not only do you have bureaucratic accountability, I think we should all have bureaucratic accountability, and you were talking about the fact that it has been triggered by the expenses scandal, at least in this country, in the UK, but I think that corporate accountability is important, and therefore when you have a government contract, especially I think in the case where we have public data and we outsource the refinement of this public data at a later stage, or whatever, the example of Google digitizing the British Library books, what is happening as far as the contract between the public, the state, the public sector and the private sector. Shouldn't we all know about this? Shouldn't this be open? I think there's a very big debate to have about that, because that is concerning the status of the data. Is the data going to be open? Is the data going to be remain? What is the status? People should be able to know from the contract or know the conditions what they can do or not do with this data. And if it's our data, because it's the books that are being held in the British Library, where anybody who can walk in and look at these books, we should know this, because we're the taxpayer, we're paying to have the British Library carry on doing what it does. So I think that was a very interesting point as well.